Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining tonight's event. I'm Emily. I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events on our website at powells.com. We're looking forward to welcoming Aidan Thomas on September 1st and Chanel Miller on September 3rd, among many others. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As well, if you haven't already done so, you may sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome April Henry, June Her, and L E Flynn in conversation with Miranda Doyle. In Girl in the White Van, April Henry's latest heart-stopping YA thriller, a teen girl is assumed to have run away, but she's actually been kidnapped and must figure out how to escape and rescue another kidnapped victim. The Silence of Bones, June Her's elegant and haunting YA debut, follows a 16-year-old indentured servant within the police bureau who becomes entangled in the politically charged investigation into the murder of a noblewoman. And All Eyes on Her, L E Flynn's latest book, is a gripping YA thriller told from the point of view of 6 people in the suspected killer's life, but not in the perspective of the suspected killer herself. And Miranda Doyle is a district librarian for Lake Oswego. She's also the Intellectual Freedom Chair for the Oregon Association of School Libraries. So tonight's Q&A also includes tonight's event also includes a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A box. If you don't see it, you can try clicking that more. If you have a question, please ask it in that function. As well, you can always upvote a question if someone else has asked one that you'd also like to know the answer to. Perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting the authors and Powell's by purchasing the books at powells.com. I'll be sharing links in the chat this evening. Now, please welcome the authors.
Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's start off with you telling us a little bit about your new book. And in particular, I'm curious, how would you describe the genre? There's some times that I thought they were thrillers or mysteries or suspense or a little bit of all three. And what drew you to these particular genres? Why are you writing the stories you are? And we can start with June.
Okay. Hi, my name is June Her, and I'm the author of The Silence of Bones. And it's about a 16-year-old girl named Sol who is indentured to the police bureau. And she partners up with an inspector to investigate into the murder of a dead noblewoman. And this book is set in Joseon, Korea, so that specifically 1800. And it's a YA historical mystery. And I was drawn to this genre because, you know, I've just grown up really enjoying mystery shows and mystery books, especially Tana French. She's my all-time favorite author. And I was really intimidated about writing mystery in the beginning because it was my first time. But I really appreciated how mystery has such a solid structure. Like, you know, there's the murder that occurs, and then you have to slowly make your way towards solving the case. And so I really enjoyed that structure, and so I ended up writing a book, a historical fiction revolving around a murder. And I thought it matched well with history because for me, as a Korean, even though I'm a Korean, I found Korean history to be very mysterious in the sense that I grew up mostly in Canada. And so I didn't know too much about Korean history. So as I was learning more about Korea, I almost felt like it was solving a mystery in itself, like trying to unlock and understand my own personal history from my homeland. So yeah, that's how I was drawn to the genre.
All right, thank you. And I'll just call in the order they see you on my screen. So April.
Okay, I had to run go get my book. Oh wait, it's blurring into the background. This is the Girl in the White Van. It came out in July 28th, and I consider it to be a thriller. I write both mysteries and thrillers, and even my mysteries have a lot of thrill in them. I love a fast-paced book with high stakes. I don't ever want to write a book about a girl who can't decide who to go to the prom with, because I don't care. I want something where someone is going to die if they make a bad choice. So this book was partially inspired by a real-life kidnapper who was stalking our neighborhood, who actually ended up being shot to death by the police in front of my martial arts school. I take Kung Fu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the part of the book is also inspired by Bruce Lee. I was already a big fan of Bruce Lee, and I ended up using a lot of quotes from Bruce Lee to introduce chapters in the book. So, but basically I write thrillers and I want to be fast-paced.
Great, thank you. And Lori?
Yep, my book is All Eyes on Her. It came out on August 18th, and it is I would consider it like a psychological thriller or psychological suspense. It's the story of there's a girl and a boy who go into the woods on a hike. It's their boyfriend and girlfriend. And only the girl comes back out, and the boy's body is found. And the story kind of takes shape from there and unravels as to what really happened in the woods. And I purposely didn't tell it from either perspective of the girlfriend or the boyfriend. It's told from the perspectives of everybody else, like people who know them, who liked them, who disliked them. So there's like 6 main point of view characters, and then also just some random peripheral ones, and newspaper articles, texts, diary entries, blog posts. So it's a lot of different opinions coming at you all at once. And I purposely did that because I wanted to show how much the media sort of scrutinizes and demonizes teenage girls in particular. I was really inspired by the Amanda Knox case and the flurry of like the media circus around that, essentially, and how it became less about what she did and more about like who she was, like what she's doing in her personal life, and the way that the media sort of treated her. I was just fascinated by that. So that sort of had a role in this story. And I think the reason I'm drawn to writing books like this is because I have a dark and twisted mind, I guess. But I think I'm always just like really interested in putting characters in really impossible situations and sort of seeing what they do and how they get out of it. Especially, it's fun. I don't plot my books. I just sort of fly by the seat of my pants. So I like to be surprised by what I write too. So that's part of the fun for me. So that's always like what I'm hoping to, if readers are surprised too. So, yeah.
Thank you. I did imagine all 3 of you had pretty dark imaginations and inner lives. Between the time when I assume you wrote these books, and now, a lot has changed in the world, and I'm wondering like how has your life changed, but also how has promoting a book changed, because you all have previous books that you've written. What's it like promoting a book or talking about a book, having one come out now? And we can start with June.
So my book debuted right at probably like close to the beginning of the pandemic. So my book debuted on April 21st. And I had a book launch set up and everything. But then, the bookstores decided to close down for a very legitimate reason. And so initially I was a bit bummed out. We had to move the book launch to an online platform. So we did it on Instagram Live, I think, with Kat Cho. And it actually turned out to be one of the most wonderful experience ever. Because I think we kind of assumed no one would show up, because it was still relatively new doing book launches online. But people were showing up, and like both of us were tearing up. We were having so much fun online. Like it went over an hour, and we had to start a live video again, and people would move on to the next live as well. And so it was really encouraging. And I noticed a lot of even established authors really stepping up to support debut authors, and that was encouraging as well. So I felt like, there's that saying, like, the darker the night, the brighter the stars. And I really felt that, like, even though it was a really dark time, I felt very supported. And now I think I'm kind of trying to understand what it means to be an author in the middle of a pandemic, because, we noticed when I think of debuting or just the author life, you kind of imagine meeting readers in person. So that's how I kind of imagined being an author. But then without that experience, I'm starting to realize, at the end of the day, what we're meant to do is just, get to work and write the book. And so in a sense, I kind of appreciate just this experience forcing me to just focus on my next book rather than getting too distracted by just the busyness of the other author side. Yeah.
Thank you. And April?
Oh, The Girl in the White Van was delayed by 2 months because I think when they made that decision, they thought it would all be over by July 28th. And weirdly, my book previous to that, Run, Hide, Fight Back, was delayed 18 months because it had a shooting in it, and the book was going to come out right after Parkland, and they worried it would seem insensitive, even though the two shootings were completely different. Mine was about domestic terrorists. So I've had this experience now twice of having books moved back. This is my 25th book, so I've done a lot of events, and I didn't really miss having an event so much. It wasn't like June, who was the debut. That's a completely different thing. What I do miss is I usually would have spent the spring doing a ton of school visits, and I didn't do, obviously everything. I was going to be in 22 different cities, and I wasn't any place. I was just at home. So one of the things I did was I made 50 videos. Every morning I would do a Facebook Live and then put it on my website with writing tips and answering readers' questions. And I put it on my YouTube channel. And it was just a way to try and connect with readers and students. And so, I'm still getting fan mail, but it's definitely a different feeling, especially as we realize we're in this for the long haul, and it's not going away anytime soon. So, but you got to put your head down and write, like June said. So that's why I have 2 books I'm working on right now. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. And Lori?
Yeah, like April, my book was delayed from June 2nd to August 18th, and we definitely had a sense of optimism that the world would be back to normal in August, which obviously didn't happen. So I think it was just reconciling expectations and realizing that, sort of embracing that things aren't going to look the same. There's not going to be in-person events. There's not going to be a bookstore launch party. And I was definitely a little bit bummed out because I love the social aspect and getting to meet people in person, and I just find it so energizing and fun to meet with other people who are passionate about books in person. But I've realized that you can have that same sense of community online. It's different, but you got to embrace it and sort of roll with it, because we don't know how long this is going to be our new normal for, and what the future is going to look like. It's definitely been a weird time. A lot has changed for me personally too. I just had a baby 3 weeks ago. So a pregnancy during the pandemic was very interesting as well. So it's been a very busy several months in my life, and a lot has changed. But I think it's all like June and April have said. It's makes you recenter your focus and kind of get back to the basics, and makes you realize writing the next thing is always going to be your job foremost as an author, and it's my favorite part anyway. So it sort of just made me feel lucky to to have that to go back to, that just butt in the chair and write. So I'm working on my next YA book right now, and my adult book is coming out next year as well. So it's enough to keep me busy.
All right, thank you. So all 3 of you write books that are a little bit dark or a lot dark and suspenseful. Why do you think people love them so much, those topics? I will tell you, when I'm book talking to my students, they just gobble them up. They love them. There are students who want something, sweeter, but they're really easy to get students to take them out the door. Why do you think that is, that people are drawn to these topics? June?
Well, I'm kind of asking myself, why do I spend so much time watching Crimewatch? And I think as dark as like mystery and like murder is, there's this great sense of satisfaction in the end when the culprit is actually caught, and justice is achieved. And I feel like for example, when I read Tana French's book, what I love about it is that it doesn't just focus on the mystery itself, moving from evidence A, B, C, D, but it also focuses on, what does it take for an investigation to, break a detective, and you see characters spiraling and things getting out of control during the climax, but then they somehow get it back together and chase after the truth again. And so what I love writing about when it comes to mystery is also the human aspect of it, like what makes people, first of all, commit crime, and on the flip side, what makes people even put their life on the line to usually even solve a case on the behalf of someone else. And I think there's just so much both scary and also inspiring things that surface when it comes to mystery novels and solving mysteries. And so I think that's part of the allure to it. It's just it's so different from the life most of us live, and yet we're able to relate to that desire to achieve justice. And yeah.
Thank you. And April?
Oh, I think in real life, when you read about somebody who died, it's usually something stupid. It's two people having an argument and they're both drunk, and one or both of them has a gun. And that there's no satisfaction in reading about that. Criminals in real life are not cool fava bean eating geniuses who drink Chianti. They're just not great people, and even a lot of times they're not that bright. Justice is often not served, like June said. So I think it's presented with a little bit cleaner, better, more exciting, more dramatic than the real life of what really happens. And also, for my books, I do a ton of research. So if people want to learn, just like I'm sure with your books, June, if they want to learn about historical Korea, they could read your book. Or with my books, if there's anything with police procedure or DNA or fingerprinting, or I was just talking to an expert in explosives, so that if you read it, you're learning something. So there's that extra benefit to it.
Thanks. And Lori?
I really love to sort of be placed in the mind of a character who might not be the most likable person or might have a lot of dark impulses. So I think that's sort of what I do with my books. And I think people are sort of drawn to that. They, like to be in this person's head sometimes as very different from their own life, hopefully. But I think I like reading books like that, where you're placed in the head of someone who has this descent into darkness and having it feel believable and not cliched. That's sort of just a challenge that I'm always up to visiting, because I find it really fascinating. I think as readers, we're all we all like to be in the minds of characters and sort of see what they would do and how that would differ from what we would do in that person's shoes, and how sometimes maybe that line is blurrier than we think. And I always find it something I challenge myself to in my writing is, there's a very moral gray area between everybody. And there's no real hero or villain, at least in my books. There's, everyone's sort of a little bit of both. And I guess I find it fascinating. I'm drawn to really dark books myself. So when I write, I like to sort of put my characters in these impossible situations and see how they kind of get themselves out of it. And I think that's, yes, that's sort of my method for what I like. And I don't know, I just really like twisted, dark things. So it sounds like we all do. So we're in good company. So if I can write something that's both believable and sort of chilling, and also has like a, I also like to sort of imbue my work with like a bent on like society and what's, you know, undertone as to like, you know, some sort of social issues and things women face or teenage girls. So that's another layer I like to add in, and that I find fascinating to explore.
Yeah. So as a school librarian, as I'm selecting books, that what grades they're appropriate for is a part of my job, and looking at the age levels. When you write your books, are you thinking about your audience as teenagers? I'm sure a lot of adults read your books as well. Like, how are you balancing that? And, do you just not think about that at all in terms of content or language or some of the themes? We'll start with June.
So my book is targeted towards ages 13 to 18 or 12 to 18. But I'm always a bit hesitant, like when a 13-year-old is like, can I read your book? I'm like, I guess you, like, I know some 13-year-olds that have read my book and they were able to digest it, but there is a lot of dark content in my book because it revolves around murder, and I don't really shy away from the topic or even like being a somewhat graphic, like trying to be as realistic as possible. But that was my debut. But I wrote that book mainly for myself. But then when it came to writing my second book, I found myself a bit more aware of the readers my book was meant to target. Because with my first book, I never thought it would get published, but then it got published. I'm like, oh my gosh, oh no, they're gonna read really dark stuff, but they were fine with it because I tried to balance it as well as possible. But with my second book, I found myself trying to tone down the violence a little bit more. If I felt like it wasn't really adding to the story or if it wasn't meaningful in any way. But at the same time, I still believe it's important to be as realistic as possible, because when I was young, when I was a teen, I read adult book, I read YA book, I didn't really discriminate. And so I feel like, you know, teens are able to take on more than they know, and if it's a bit too much for them, they could always put the book down. So I try not to traumatize them, but I still try to be as realistic as possible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And April?
Well, first of all, I write for myself. First, I mean, I do think about people who are going to be reading it, but that's, if I'm happy, I figure they'll be happy. And a long time ago, I was writing for Thomas Nelson, which is a Christian imprint, and they have two kinds of books. One is super Christian, and one is just like regular books minus swears and sex. So that writing for them taught me you do not have to say exactly what a person said. You can just say they swore, and readers will probably have an even more inventive swear than you would have had. And I have chosen, I mean, when you're writing thrillers all the time, I've chosen to make people maybe be threatened with rape, but I've chosen not to write about rape. I feel like that would really take my book in a different direction. I try and make it realistic for why they didn't get raped, and I don't describe violence in great detail. I think people are good at filling in details. If you have someone look at someone with horror, that might be enough, you know, that you don't need to say exactly what's happening. The monster in the closet is probably scarier than the monster you can see. And then my characters usually are not sexually active in books. What they're up to off the page is not my business. So, but I do not usually, I don't think I've had them having sex in any of my teen books. So I'm sure if they did, they would be very responsible and use a condom and have a lot of talk about. But I do sometimes worry. It's just as I need to make certain choices sometimes. I have seen librarians lose jobs over content in books. So I always keep them in the back of my mind. I do not want to ever have that situation where a librarian in a very conservative area lost a job because she used your book. So
I just jump in for a second that I mean, I hate the idea that you would have to think about that. And as, you know, intellectual freedom advocates, we're
well, I don't know that it colors it very much, but if I have two choices, I'll make the choice I feel is not going to mean that the librarian is in front of the school board trying to justify her choice.
Right, right. Lori?
Yeah, I think my books, I would call them upper YA. I think they're more for older teens. There's like, I guess there's, they're always called edgy. So I think there's a lot of like upper YA type content that older teens would probably more relate to. Like there's sex in the books, there's some violence and a lot of horrible choices made. But I think for me, it's all a matter of, does this advance this story and is this true to the character? Because I never want to put anything on the page just for, you know, shock value to the reader. That's not something I'm interested in. For me, it all has to feel authentic to the character. And I think that's the most important thing I connect with when reading a book is, it isn't like, do I agree with this person's choices or not? It's, does this feel like it could be a real flesh and blood person? Does this feel authentic to what this character would do? And so that's always something I try to do. I would definitely call my books character driven in that sense. Like they're, they make a lot of awful decisions sometimes, but you know, so did I when I was a teenager. So I think it's, you know, just a matter of, does this feel right for this character to do? And how does this advance the story? Those are two questions I ask myself before I sort of put something on the page. And I do have a lot of parents or, you know, friends with teenagers ask if their kid can read the book. And I don't shy away from telling them what's in it. I'll sort of let them make up their own minds because I know every teenager is different. But, you know, definitely probably not a 13-year-old, but, you know, everyone's different. And I think that's sort of up to each family to decide. But yeah.
Well, thank you. That's so interesting to me because, you know, the characters have to seem real to teenage readers. And if it's, if we're too worried about, oh, is this going to offend someone, then that won't happen.
Yeah, my characters probably offend a lot of people. And yeah, so, oh well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's see. So in our libraries and in our schools, we're trying to buy more diverse books and more own voices books by authors of color. How does that factor into your writing, and how are you able to write diverse characters who are different than you? How do you handle that in your books? And I'll start with June.
So for me, so I've been writing since I was a teen. I'm not a teen anymore, but I've always been writing about England, like Victorian England, Regency England, and I knew very little about Korean history growing up. I did go to school in Korea when I was in high school, but I always slept through all my classes, so I knew almost nothing. But then after I continued to receive rejections on my British historical books, I decided, you know, that I felt it was time to look into different histories. I looked at different world histories, and my last choice was Korea. As a Korean, I always wanted to avoid the idea of falling into that label of the exotic Asian writer. But then I realized times had really changed, and you know, Asia is not considered exotic anymore. It's as part of history as, you know, British history, Canadian history, US history. And so I realized that there was I wanted to kind of figure out why I was resisting Korean history so much. And I think it's because I was just exposed to so little Korean history, and also that history was also oftentimes stereotyped as like just entirely pain. And I think, the immigrant story and when Korea was colonized by Japan, headphones fell off. They're all really important books, but then that was the only type of book I knew. And so I thought Korean history was just all about pain and suffering and poverty and so on. But then when I began to finally look into Korean history, I was like fascinated by it, and I just fell head over heels in love with it. And I think as I was researching, I started to realize that, a part of me that I didn't know, that I didn't really understand. I thought I was just like this lone island, but as I researched, I realized there's a lot of who I am reflected in history, and I came to learn more about myself. And so part of my reason for writing the book is I think there's a lot of like Korean diaspora in the teens growing up who don't really appreciate Korean history, who find that it's irrelevant to them. And so I kind of wrote it to show them like Korean history is really cool. And I also want to show people who weren't Korean that also there's so much more to Korean history than just this small portion of Korea that we are often exposed to. Or, as much as I love K-pop, that there's more to Korea than just K-pop. And so that's kind of that's how I came to appreciate diversity, and how I kind of wanted to, I guess, share my own culture a bit more by sharing what really touched me and what helped me learn about more of who I am. Because I feel like even though, not everyone is Korean, but then I feel like there are ways to relate to cultures that we don't really know. And I think one of the most beautiful parts of historicals, and especially non-Western historicals, is that you realize that the world is so much bigger than just what we kind of learn in the classroom. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I enjoyed your book so much was when I started, I was like, this is a place and time and culture I don't know much about. This is something new and different for me.
Yes.
April?
Let's see, I see people are starting to put in Q&A, but so I'm just saying if people want to, because in a few minutes we'll be going to Q&A. They talk about, I can't remember that person who had that great analogy of windows and doors, or windows and mirrors. That readers are looking to either see themselves or they're looking for a window into a different experience. So I think as a white author, it's kind of a tricky thing. I try to vary my cast and do my research and have sensitivity readers, but I think there are stories that are not mine to tell. Especially if I was going to write, like, I don't know, about a Hispanic girl whose parents are migrant workers or something. That's a lot of stuff that I don't know. And I don't know that I could ever do enough research. I don't speak Spanish. I don't know that I would have enough in common with that background. Now, would I make that person a side character? Yes, but I wouldn't make it be my main character. I did do 2 books with a blind character, which is another form of diversity, and disability is an interesting form of diversity because it's one that we all could have access to tomorrow, that we could flip from being able-bodied to having some issue with our hearing or a sight. So I felt good about it when I did it, and I did a ton of research, and I do hear from blind readers who think that I am blind, but I don't know in today's climate if I would feel comfortable enough if I was going to start over. Like, would I write a book about a deaf kid main character? I don't know if I would feel like I could do enough research to do that. I do want to do one though about a kid with a prosthesis. I think that would be interesting, or in a wheelchair. There's no books for those kids, and I would like to write a book for one of those kids.
Thank you. And Lori, do you want to answer? And then we'll switch to some of the questions that are coming in.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's really important to, make sure that the story you're telling is yours to tell, and leave room for marginalized creators to tell their own stories. I think that's really important. So that's something that I'm always very conscious of. And also, it's important to, have your book reflect the way the world is, and, have a diverse cast of characters. but also important to do your research and, you know, make sure that these people, you know, that you don't have people reading as stereotypes in your work. So that's something I'm always really conscious of as well. But I think definitely, like I would never write a book from the perspective of, you know, somebody of a different race or a different, you know, religion or anything like that, because I want to leave that those spaces for those creators to tell their own stories, and I sit back and read them and learn from those people. So I think that's something really important.
Great, thank you. So here's a question from the Q&A to have all panelists. During your research for the book, was there anything that you discovered that was interesting or fascinating to you, but you weren't able to include it in the story? And they wanted you to share something, some interesting discovery that you weren't able to use. So
this is April,
okay.
and one of the things that I found when I was working on that book, because it was inspired by that real kidnapper, is it supposed to go to me?
Yeah, actually, I think
no.
if you just
keep
jump
talking.
into this one.
So one of the things that when I was researching that kidnapper was I caught all of the reports that were made to the grand jury, which I thought those were not public, but I found them. And so I read everyone's description of what happened, and they were all completely different. They all saw the gunfight between the cop and the kidnapper, but every single person said something different happened. And that event didn't take place in my book, but it was so fascinating to see that even people who are supremely interested in what is happening and figuring it out did not see the same things at all. Any of you guys have one you want to share? Oh, Jen works.
I think for me, it would be, so back in Joseon, Korea, it was super gender segregated. So men weren't allowed to touch or interact with women who weren't related to them. And so they ended up forming these group of women called Linyas, and they were palace nurses, because basically female royals were dying because the male physicians were like, I can't touch you, but I need to diagnose what's going on with you. And so they'd like tie a string around the women's pulse, trying to like measure their pulse, but then it's very inaccurate. So they ended up forming these group of women. They used the slave class, women in the slave class, to raise them up into nurses. And I was really fascinated by that. And that kind of inspired my book, in the sense that if a palace nurse, or just these nurses that were formed, if they ended up with, and they were teens, if they ended up with a bad grade, they would be like, and they'd be like thrown into the police bureau, and they would have to serve as servants, like servants of all work, and also police investigators. And so, yeah, that was their punishment for bad grades. And I thought that was really interesting.
I can't really think of anything too much. I think what I found the most fascinating about looking into things for this book was just how many media cases out there are that focus more on a woman's behavior in her spare time, or how she looks, or her sexual history, than anything else. And you just don't see that happen for men. And I found that double standard really fascinating, and also just very annoying. So I really, let that fuel my work. So that was, yeah.
Thank you. So there's a question about research and experts, and it's for April. How do you get in contact with experts for law enforcement when doing research? But I wonder if we could broaden it to, for all of you, how do you get in touch with people that you want to interview if you do interviews, and how willing are they to give you their time? Like, is it difficult to get them to spend time answering your questions, or are they eager to do it?
This is April. Can I get it to bounce back to me? No, it doesn't like me anymore. Well, you guys can just listen to my beautiful voice. I think there's a bunch of things that you can do. One thing that has been super useful for me is my author Facebook page. I will put on there hey, I'm looking for somebody who knows about type 2 diabetes and hiking. And people who have type 2 diabetes and hike will respond. So sometimes for odd questions like that, I have been able to ask, crowdsource it. I've even crowdsourced a name of a creepy motel that I had in an upcoming book. There's an online group on Google I/O called Crime Scene Writers, and that's a bunch of retired cops and retired other types of law enforcement. And if you come in, you can look through people's other questions that have been asked. And when there wasn't a pandemic, I used to go to the Writers Police Academy, which is held at a real police and fire academy. And to be honest, cops are closed mouthed and they do not like to talk, and they're not chatty, and they don't want to be thanked by name in your book. Sometimes they'll get upset by that. So, but I've built up this little relationship with cops and FBI agents. And you know what, the person who is the explosion expert, I had been trying to find somebody that could tell me if you were hiding in a old nuclear fallout shelter and there was a bomb, could you survive? And I found somebody who wrote an article about explosions, and she didn't have any idea, but she said, there's this woman who's an expert. I just read her book called In the Waves about an explosion on a submarine during the Civil War. And I contacted that lady on Twitter, and she was amazingly helpful. So sometimes just reaching out to strangers. I have a guy I've never met who will tell me how I can make a door lock that is supposed to be locked or unlocked that is not supposed to be unlocked. And they get a kick out of it. I think people, other than law enforcement, people are really into it. And then you just kind of got to find a way into law enforcement, like with the Crime Scene Writers group on Google. How about you guys? How do you get your stuff, your research?
That's so cool. Yeah, I love that. That is, you know, like what you've experienced with crime. That's like dream for me. For me, it's more like, it's because I'm writing like crime that takes place in history. It's been an experience. So yeah, like I've tried reaching out to like professors in Korea who major in my specific time period to ask like questions and hopefully get clarifications on how to write a mystery set in that period. But no one replied. Maybe because I didn't write the email in Korean well enough. There aren't that many experts in my specific period in Canada either. Like I have connections to PhD students who study Korea, but it's after pre-colonized Korea. And so for me, it's more like books are my best friends. Like the period I'm focusing on was somewhat well documented. A lot of things got burned up as well, but from what was documented, there's a lot of scholarly resources based on it. And so I've had to brush up my Korean in order to access books written in Korean that could give me a better idea of the world so that I could actually build a believable mystery set in there. But yeah, like I haven't been able to reach out to like cops or anything like that. So I try to stay away from the contemporary Korea because I have no idea if I could reach out to Korean cops or anything like that. But yeah, I think, you know, what, you know, you're able to do, April, it's like amazing. I admire that.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer that cool, but
Yeah.
A lot of mine is just research online and in books, and I also pick my dad's brain all the time. He's a lawyer, so it's helpful to know some of those. There's some lawyers in my family, so that's I bother them a lot with my random questions, and my Google search history makes me look like a psychopath. So I'm sure I'm not the only one, but that's if anyone were to ever find it, and like sometimes I'm like, if my husband sees this, he's gonna think I'm like plotting to kill him. So anyway, I'm sure a lot of us share that in common. So.
Yeah.
Fun.
Lots of searches about where to hide the body, and that's great. I'm gonna include two questions here. One is for beginning writers out there looking to become an author, what tips and advice would you give? But then someone else asked specifically advice for someone who's a mystery or thriller writer, if anyone wants to address that specifically.
April?
I will jump in. I will jump in, even though we will look at June's photo while I'm jumping in. I think the secret to getting published is to read a lot, to write a lot, to think about what you're writing. And then the fourth one is the tricky one that a lot of people do not want to do, which is to not give up. A lot of people will be like, I want to be published, next year or something. And I get contacted by kids all the time who have written a book and they want to find a publisher, and they don't realize that's not even how it works anymore. You get an agent and they get a publisher, and it's probably going to be 2 years before that book comes out. And that's why a lot of publishers are usually not interested in working with teenagers, because we all know that teenagers change a lot in 2 years, and that they probably wouldn't have the maturity to deal with a lot of feedback and a lot of comments. So not that there haven't been people who sold books in high school. I think of Cody Keplinger. She wrote this book called The Duff. She sold that book in high school, and the agent called and said they had a contract for her to sign. And she said, well, my mom has to sign it too. And the agent said, why does your mom have to sign anything? And she said, because I'm 17. And the agent had thought because she had a school email address and could only talk after 3 p.m. on weekdays that she was a teacher. So I can't tell you how long it would take, but if you are, you don't even have to be the world's best writer. I've seen the world's best writers not get published because they gave up. The real trick to probably anything, being an actor or being anything in the creative field, is to not give up. So if it's what you want, read a lot, write a lot, and think about your writing, and don't give up.
Thank you.
That's my sermon.
My
sermon with you guys looking at June.
I'm not sure why you're not seeing yourself, but I think we can all.
Oh, you see me? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I see you.
Oh, I feel seen.
I think for me, my advice would be to, like April was saying, make sure you read a lot as well as write a lot, and read books in your genre, and know what's not just like what is selling and what's popular, but what you like and why you like it. That was an important thing for me, is like sort of the books that stick with you. Why do they work? And sort of, if you can answer those questions, it helps you, I think, with your own work. It also helps to, have a community of writers, however that looks to you. I joined Twitter when I was a new author, and there's a huge community of people out there who are happy to help and talk with you. And so it doesn't have to be like an in-person group, especially in the time of the pandemic. That's obviously hard for a lot of us, but there could be a huge community behind you just online that could help you. And you have to do the work, and you also have to put in the research into agents and query letters, and all of that can seem a bit mystifying, but I found talking to people online was the most helpful thing. And trial and error. You're never gonna write a perfect query letter the first time around. I wrote 2 books and queried 2 books that went nowhere before getting an agent. So it's all about perseverance and just powering forward, and realizing that all of us have heard no probably a lot of times before we heard yes. So just keep going, and don't look at any writing as a waste of time. That's my other advice, because I don't know about the other authors on this panel, but I have like Word documents galore in my computer that'll never see the light of day, and I'm fine with that. I don't see them as a waste of time, because they helped me to learn, and that's invaluable. So yeah.
Kind of like what Lori said, I think the writing community is super important to have, especially because from that community, you often find your critique partners. And I find that being able to have the courage to share what you've written is the first step to even attempting to get published. And the second important step is being thick-skinned enough to receive critiques and learning how to implement it, but also learning when certain critiques aren't quite the right fit for the vision you have for your book. And at the same time, as someone who was a very unhealthily ambitious writer as a young adult growing up, I think it's also important to know that trying to get published for most people is a marathon. It's not like a sprint. It won't happen, as April said, it won't happen for everyone like within a few months or a year or something like that. So I think it's also important to also learn that you should have more than one passion or more than one kind of hobby to also focus on that's not writing related, because I find that when you invest too much time and too much ambition into just getting published, your identity ends up getting tied into it. And then when you get rejection, you take it personally and you're like, oh no, who am I if I don't get published? So that happened to me. So I'm just saying, like, try to avoid that. And so I think it's really important to have hobbies outside of writing. And for how to write a mystery novel, I'm still learning myself. And I find that what really helps is obviously reading books in the genre, but also this might be a bad advice, but what really helps me is reading the ending first, finding out who the killer is, and then figuring out how that author managed to come to that conclusion while also tricking most of the readers into believing it was a red herring. So that has been really helpful to me. Because normally if I read a mystery novel, I can never figure out who the killer is. And by the time I find out who the killer is, I'm like, what? How did you get there? So yeah, that helps me.
Wow, that's a fascinating approach.
Well, I tell my students, you can read a book any way you want. There's no,
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you not to read the end first. I will tell you, please don't spoil it for the rest of us.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Let's see. Another question. What's the hardest part of writing a book for you? Could be just a quick answer because I think we are getting close on time.
Deadlines. I have 2 books that I have a rewrite and a first draft, and my editor was a little bit behind, so they've all come at the same time. And no matter what I'm doing, I feel guilty because I'm not doing both. I actually am doing both in a day. I'll do one in the morning and one in the afternoon, but even that's getting confusing because one's written in past tense and one's in present. And I start cross-mingling my characters, thinking they belong in a different book. So the deadline for me right now is probably the hardest.
For me, it's the first drafts. I hate first drafts. When I write first drafts, I feel like the most horrible author ever, the worst writer in the world. So trying to, hold on to my confidence while writing a first draft is always the most difficult thing ever.
I think for me, it's a matter of not being too hard on myself when what comes out on the page is not exactly what was in my head. Sort of what June was saying, like, those first drafts are kind of scary because sometimes you're writing and you're like, this isn't how I pictured it. And just sort of letting go of that and having fun and going with the flow and reminding yourself that you can fix absolutely anything later, but you can't fix it if it doesn't exist. So that's what I always remind myself in those trying times.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of wrap it up, when I'm in a school library and I've got a bunch of students there and they're rushing to get back to class and I hand them a book or I hold up a book and I'm trying to sell it to them, I'll try just a 1 sentence, this is what it's about. So could you give me your 1 sentence, how do I sell your book to a teenager standing in the library?
I'm the worst at this. I would just say a Korean historical drama in book form.
Awesome, thank you.
So sweet. I'll say when Savannah is kidnapped after Kung Fu class, she and a previous captive must rely on their wits, bravery, and wisdom from Bruce Lee to break free.
Thank you.
I would say All Eyes on Her boy and a girl go into the woods, and only the girl comes back out.
That would do it. Great. So I think we're
So there's,
got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, do you want to do one more before we wrap it up here? You guys?
Do you have time for one more question? Or
should we just, since we just did the wrap up, should we just end it? I guess?
yeah, I think we could leave it at that. I loved the one sentence summaries and the chance to really quickly answer the question of why should I read this book? Why should I buy it?
Those were great. Thank you all so much. This was so much fun. It was such a pleasure to host you, and thank you everybody out there for coming. Please do consider purchasing copies of all the books online at powells.com, and please do check out our other upcoming events. We hope to see you at one soon. Until then, have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you so much.